All right, and welcome back. So we've got our game here that we last time had a look at. We created a little bit better way of moving, a little bit better interaction using constants, and we have also got some nicer textures on our player here. But we still have kind of a game that's a bit weird. We've got this map, this plane here, which we can push our objects around, and we can also just drive off the side here. So I'd like to create something that might allow me to make this a little bit more of like a maze, and maybe we could start building up into a 3D world. So there's a couple ways of doing that. You might be inclined to do kind of a poor way to begin with. Um, Obviously, the walls can't be made of these rigid bodies that we've done here. Otherwise, we'd just be able to push the walls off because our kinematic body has the ability to do that. However, much like the floor, if we were to build walls out of static bodies, then we would be able to create something really cool and to be able to contain our player. Um, Now, the first way you might be inclined to do is actually do something very similar to the blocks. And we could make ourselves a new scene, create kind of like a Lego or Minecraft style block that we could then place all around the outside, creating a border. We could even create walls for a maze, or we could even go vertically up if we wanted when we get some gravity in there, which we'll come into a little bit later. But there is a much better way of doing this rather than duplicating all these little blocks, because you notice we've got just four here for these rigid bodies that are falling down here. But can you imagine if we were going to create all the walls, we'd have hundreds and hundreds of blocks here, which would be quite painful to place. And if you did Godot with me last year when we did 2D stuff, you'll remember we ran into a similar problem with the platforms. And rather than duplicating hundreds of little platforms, we created something called a tile map. Well, we have something very similar in 3D called a grid map, but we've got to build our objects because we don't have the graphics or the sprites all set for it. We've got to build our actual object. So what I'm going to do is create a brand new scene here. And in that, I'm going to create a 3D scene, just like our usual one here. I'm going to call these wall blocks. And the idea being here is that I'm going to make a bunch of blocks that could be used in my level one and painted almost like say you would in Minecraft or in a lot of level design programs. Now, one of the differences you might be inclined to do, we'd create a new one. You might want to make a new static body. However, um, the grid map requires that we use a mesh. So we're actually going to flip around the process that we normally do. Rather than make a static body and then add a mesh and then add a collision shape to it, we're going to start off with a mesh and have a child that is a static body. Essentially, it does the same thing. It's just flipping the order around. So I'm going to make a mesh instance here, and I'm going to call this block one. To that, I am going to add, obviously we don't see anything right now. Um, I'm going to add, oh, sorry, let's, before we do that, let's actually add what our block is. We're going to add our cube mesh there, which will create that for our block one. Now, to that as a child, I'm going to add a static body. That means it's not going to move around or do anything. Of course, we get that error warning there because we know that a static body needs a collision shape to know where the extents are. So I am going to add that a collision shape just like we did before, and now I have got myself a little block that I could work with. I might want to have, oh, one last thing here, don't forget, like I did before, this collision shape needs a shape, so let's make that a new box. Now that's a pretty boring one here, so I may want to add to the mesh, remember. I may want to add a material to that. Right now there's no material on it. We get that boring white, and we did this last time, which was to create a new spatial material, and then click on it, and then I get all of those settings that I can tweak with and play there. I'm going to open albedo. If you wanted to give it like a brick kind of texture or a wall or a stone or something like that, you could. In this case, I'm going to go simply just quickly do something like red. and then make that my block. And if that was it, then this would be okay, and we'd be able to bring this into Painted. But the nice part is with this grid map is we can make multiple blocks, all the different kind of blocks that we may want to build our world with. So I'm going to do a copy of this one just to show you how this works. And I'm just going to click on it and right click, and then I'm going to duplicate that guy. And you see we get block 2 over here, and I'm just going to move him over to the side a little bit. Now I want block 2 to be a little bit different than block 1, so you'd think, just be able to go in and tweak the material here. Um, like so, and maybe make it into something like blue, but you'll notice that something weird happens. The material actually changes the original block's material. And that's because when you duplicate these things are linked. They're using the same, they're borrowing the same material. So if I change this material, it's going to change the material of the original one. So I'm just going to go click off there and Control Z till I'm back here. So there's a little extra step we have to do, especially if you're duplicating. I could just make a new block and add a static body and add a collision shape, but I had it all done already. So I just have to essentially click on this. I've got to do 2 steps here. The first one is I've got to make this a unique mesh. Means it's not a copy of this mesh. I want it to be its own individual mesh, have its own properties. So there's a little quick way of doing this. Just click beside it, that little drop down arrow, and there's a little option here that says make unique, which means now it's basically separated itself from that block 1. Similarly, I've got to do the same for the material here, because they're actually sharing the same material. So if I change the second material, it changes the first one. So I'm going to do that exact same idea and make this material unique. Exact same idea. And now you'll notice when I click the albedo and I go and make this blue, I can have a blue one and a red one, just like so. Now I want to make sure that my size is all right. Yeah, that looks good there. So I'm going to just save this scene so I have it ready in the future. It's being called wall block because that's what I named it there. But I need to do one extra step here. I've saved this scene as a scene so I can build it later, but I also want this to be a resource that level 1 can use, that my grid map can use. So I have one more step, which is to go up here and go under Convert To, and you'll see we get 2 options here, that tile set and that mesh library. And if you did the 2D with me last year, you may remember that we had 2 tile sets for creating 2D painted backgrounds and things like that. Well, this is a mesh library. It's basically the 3D version of a tile set. So we're going to need to use that mesh library. And I'm going to call this Walls is a great one. So I'm going to save it. It's called a resource and means it can be brought into other things on Godot. So I'm going to save that walls. And now if I go back to level 1, I'd like to put all of those walls around here and to kind of contain that ball. So to do that, I'm just going to add a new node to my level 1. And this node is called a grid map. And it's kind of like a tile map we did last year if you were there. Essentially, it's a map of where these little objects are going to be. And you'll see why this is going to be so much faster than to be dragging a whole bunch of little blocks around. So I'm going to create that. And you'll see the grid map here. Right now, it's looking for a mesh library. Nothing happens. You don't get to see anything. So I'm just going to choose that mesh library I just made. I'm going to go load, and there's the walls mesh library I just exported from before. So I'm going to double click that, and you see the coolest thing happens right here. There's a little block 1 and block 2 appear in the side, just like that. And you can click on them, and you can actually get to move along here. And I get to just paint. And if I just left click, you'll see that I can create these little walls here. And if I wanted to, I can switch to block 2 and I can start to paint the walls there. Now I run into a couple little problems here. I've bought some extra ones there. If I right click with my mouse, that will delete those extra ones there. So I can just delete those like so. It's also a little awkward to kind of see what's going on in this 3D world. So you may want to choose up top here. We've got some nice ability to kind of switch different views. Now, Normally, this is what you're going to be looking at, this thing called perspective mode, which is a natural way of looking at things. You'll notice that the lines of the horizon vanish to a point. You'll see that things that are far away are smaller than things that are bigger. And it's great for looking at a 3D world, but it's actually it can be a real pain if you're trying to, say, draw like this. Say, I can't see what I'm drawing. So changing from perspective to something called orthogonal, and you may have done this if you've done any drafting or 3D work before. Orthogonal basically keeps it 3D, but removes that idea of perspective. You can see those lines do not vanish to a point in the distance, they stay parallel, and that everything looks the same size, the size that it actually is. We can also easily switch different views here. So I can look at the left, I can look at the top. If I go straight top orthogonal view, this makes it really easy to kind of draw around and make a fully contained platform there. So that's our first little thing. You can see how quick that is. And again, if you made a mistake, just right click and you can left click there. Now, if we play, you're going to see a couple things that I'm going to have to fix in a second. If we play this though, we've got now these blocks around there, and it's very quickly, and I notice it's all contained in one grid map. So if I now move around here, you can see that, whoop, it kind of worked there. You saw in a second, but it actually raised me up. And now I can roll over top of it. And notice I'm actually almost floating over this over the top here. You might not be able to see it too clearly, but I've floated on. One of the reasons is because I don't have gravity pulling on me at all. Remember, this is not a rigid body, so it's not affected by gravity. And but I was able to roll up over the wall, which was kind of strange. So let's fix that problem there. And then I also noticed that these blocks are a little bit low, and they're actually buried into my wall, and I may want them to be a little bit taller. So we can fix that part too. However, let's first of all, because even if they were short there, there's still a bit of a wall. I should be able to stop the ball here. Now, that comes to a issue that we happened to do when I first made my player. Made a lot of sense. My player's a sphere, so if I go open up my player scene, you may remember that my collision shape over here is a sphere on my sphere mesh. And that, of course, makes a lot of sense. The issue, however, is that the sphere behaves just like a regular sphere. So what can happen is the edge, especially if we've got a low wall here, the edge can kind of hook on it and it rolls up over top of the wall. So while it makes sense for if I was making a pool game or some other thing where I wanted totally realistic physics, it makes sense that that collision shape would be a sphere. For my game, it doesn't. I want it to kind of stop when it hits a wall, not have the ability to roll over top of it. So that's an easy fix. All I have to do is change that to a box shape. So even though the mesh looks like a sphere, the collision of it would be a wall. So when a wall hits a wall, it's going to stop. And if I were to save this scene and go back to level 1, let's give that a try and see if that fixed that issue. And yeah, you can see now I'm rolling into that wall and I can't go any further. Now, as for the height issue, where it's a little bit short, we've got two different ways of fixing it. First of all, the very cool part in this 3D world, you see that I'm down a little bit here, and I'm actually burying myself in. But what if I wanted to build like a tall wall here? Well, right over here on your grid map where you could choose the different things, right now we've got what's called the floor, which means I'm kind of at ground zero. But we can crack that up there, and you can actually build on top of the next level there. Ooh, and this is where your orthogonal view and design could come in handy. So you could build upwards and upwards if you wished to kind of create some height to our map, and you could go up to the level 2, and you can see we just keep building upwards and upwards here, and it allows you to kind of get some height, so you could create really 3D levels as well. However, there can be also some issues where I'm actually buried in here, so we may want to, with our grid map, either translate it, move it up a little bit, or change the cell here. Right now, the default is 2, and I've got a size 1 cell, so I can tweak that a little bit if I wanted to be able to make some finer points. Well, this is actually not working for my giant one. My block is actually too high, so I don't want to play with it that way. Let's get rid of that. Um, but you may also want, depending on where the center is, um, I've got the center Y, center Z, and center X, depending on the model you've brought in. That's not working for a problem there, but the translation here, I may want to move it up. Let's say, is this in the Y direction? Yeah, I can move it up in the Y direction, so the whole grid moves up a little bit here. So this transform, these translations here, allow us to move things around, and they're very similar, just like the rotation and the scale, the things we did in code before. So there you go. Now you've got the ability to kind of create, oh, I went a bit too high, uh, create these 3D worlds and create kind of like maybe a maze for your ball to go in, but also we could start to go beyond this platform here and actually get some vertical height uh, in there, which we'll be able to do in our next video. But what I'd love you to do here is to kind of create yourself a little bit of a maze, figure out a starting point for your ball and figure out how you could move through the maze to an endpoint. You may even want that endpoint to be more vertical, which we'll get into when we get into some real world physics there. So have a little fun with that, build some stuff, maybe make some more interesting wall blocks rather than just these red and blue ones, put some textures on there and see what kind of world that you can build.